Hello and welcome back to Rock, Paper, Shotgun. Liam here, and I'm joined once again by Catherine. How's it going, Catherine?
Good, Liam. How are you?
I'm not too bad, and I wanted to get you on the channel today because we're going to talk Final Fantasy VII, and there is no one better on the team to discuss Final Fantasy with than yourself as our resident Final Fantasy fan, which I think is fair to describe you as.
For my sins, yes.
So Square Enix have just released Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion, a remake of the PSP game Crisis Core, and it's made us ask the question of where's the best place for new players to start when it comes to Final Fantasy VII. Now, before we start, two things. One, there are going to be some light spoilers in this video. Nothing too major, just it's hard to discuss the current state of Final Fantasy VII without sort of spoiling a little bit of it, which I think is fair to say.
Yeah, I'd say probably quite major spoilers. If you don't want any Final Fantasy spoiler chat, like I would stop listening and just go and play the games, because yeah, like it is, as you said, Liam, it's kind of impossible to talk about Crisis Core without some pretty major story spoilers.
Yeah, and also I'm going to give a very brief primer as to where we're at in terms of the series and your starting point. So in 2020, Square Enix released Final Fantasy VII Remake, which was this long-awaited retread of the classic 1997 PlayStation 1 JRPG. However, it isn't a straight remake like many fans are expecting. It's actually the first part of a trilogy that's sort of a one-to-one remake, but also sort of a reboot that's deviating from the original game, whilst also being aware of it, confusingly.
Yeah, it's very meta.
Very, very meta. And alongside Remake, Square have also announced Ever Crisis, which is sort of a remake of Final Fantasy VII and its compendium spin-off titles, but is also a loot box mobile game, so that's kind of up in the air as to what that's going to be and whether that'll make its way over to other platforms. And to complicate things even further, they've just released, as mentioned before, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion, which is a remake of a 2007 PSP game that was part of the Final Fantasy VII compendium. It's a prequel that focuses on Zack, a soldier who fought alongside Cloud and Sephiroth in their adventures before the events of Final Fantasy VII. So I think, to put it simply, it's a bit complicated, all this, and if you're a new player, not really sure where to start. So before we get into that, I'd like to know, what's your history with Final Fantasy VII, Catherine?
Well, I mean, I'm probably one of these people who, I would technically say I prefer 8 to 7, which I'm very much in the minority on that. I played Final Fantasy VII like as a teenager, like probably a lot of people did, but after 8, before 9, and also had a bit of a year break in between it because I got stuck on and then just played something else for a year and then came back to it and kind of forgot everything that happened in Midgar up until that point. So I sort of came back to it thinking like, oh yeah, like I quite enjoyed this. I've sort of somehow now managed to get past the bit that I was stuck on, finished the game, enjoyed it, and then I moved on with my life. I have sort of over time, I've absorbed a lot of extra Final Fantasy VII kind of paraphernalia. I've watched the Advent Children film. I've played the remake now. I never played Crisis Core at the time because I didn't own a PSP. I also missed Dirge of Cerberus, which was another Vincent Valentine focused game that was a third-person shooter for some reason that was set after the events of the Advent Children film. So yeah, it's not my favourite Final Fantasy game, but I do like it and I've played a fair amount of it over the years.
You've got a longer history with it than I do, put it that way. I came into this series in general really late. I played a lot of Final Fantasy VIII on my dad's friend's PlayStation 1 when we borrowed it at the time. I was very, very young.
Best Final Fantasy game.
I agree. I still have a lot of nostalgia for that game. I played a lot of Dirge of Cerberus on a friend's PS2 without any context as to what Final Fantasy VII was and thought it was the raddest thing I'd ever played in my entire life. So my first real hands-on experience of Final Fantasy VII was 2020's Remake, which I absolutely adored and really fell in love with, and can't wait for the second part. But I would say that you went in a more traditional way.
Yeah.
I think I sort of represent a more modern sort of approach to the series, and quite an unusual one. I haven't really heard of anyone who started with Remake. And as we'll discuss a little bit later on, maybe not the best way of starting the series, because like we said, it references a lot of that original game in unusual ways. So you've just played Crisis Core, and I'd love to know what you think about it.
I think it's perfectly fine. I'm not really sure it needs to exist, but it is a very perfectly serviceable action game that, kind of looks very nice for a 15-year-old PSP game. Like the remaster work that they've done on it graphically, kind of looks great. They've revamped the soundtrack, which I'm a big Final Fantasy soundtrack fan. I like all Final Fantasy music, so that's a big thumbs up from me. They've re-recorded all of the dialogue with all of the current voice actors to bring it, make it canon, I guess, to bring it, all into the same sort of universe. And yeah, like it's a very serviceable remaster. As I said earlier, I'm not really sure it needs to exist because it is, spoiler alert, like it is a very straightforward remake. It doesn't do anything different to the original Crisis Core. It is a shot-for-shot remake, begins and ends exactly the same way as it did in 2007, which I'm sure for many people who didn't really like the direction that Final Fantasy VII Remake went, will be perfectly happy with, in which case, this is the remaster for you. But as someone who really enjoyed and really liked what Square Enix have done with Final Fantasy VII Remake, and kind of, that I think it's quite bold that they're taking it in this kind of new, quite exciting direction by changing up, the established timeline and, introducing elements that, weren't in the original game. I went into Crisis Core expecting, I hope that they start sort of seeding some of these ideas or like planting, story points that like would explain or maybe hint at explaining the very kind of quite bombshell reveal ending at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake. But nope, it didn't do that at all. It ends exactly the same way, which felt quite disappointing for me. In some sense, you could say that this is all part of the intended timeline, in that, as we sort of saw at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake, it did imply that two timelines existed, one where the original events of both Crisis Core and Final Fantasy VII happened and played out, and then there's this version. Most of Final Fantasy VII Remake was about fighting fate and changing destiny and, basically altering the timeline. It did all get very meta. And so maybe, yes, this version of Crisis Core does exist in that original timeline. But at the same time, come on, Square Enix, like... That, you had the original game. That still exists. Let's do something different with this one. But yeah, alas, they did not. So in that sense, I found it a little bit disappointing. But yes, it's sure is a action game from 2007. I'll say that.
I wonder if they've just remade this to let people understand who Zack is.
Yeah.
In the run-up to the second part of Remake?
Yeah, probably. I suspect that there is a strong element of that, although I do also feel that, unlike you, I have sort of absorbed a lot of Final Fantasy VII nonsense over the years, and so I do kind of know who Zack and, his deal with Sephiroth is already. I mean, I didn't play Crisis Core. I've just absorbed that knowledge over time, and playing Crisis Core hasn't really either, changed or developed that knowledge in any meaningful way. So I feel like, yep, I kind of already knew all this stuff, and I'm not really sure I needed to play a 12-hour action game to kind of like, make that knowledge any firmer or sounder. As I say, I sort of went into it hoping that previously they had spoken about it being part of the wider sort of remake kind of, overarching project. So I was sort of like, yes, here we go. Let's see what mad stuff they're going to start doing with this. But yeah, unfortunately, as I say, I'm sure some people will absolutely dig it that it's a straightforward remake, and it's probably what they wanted from Final Fantasy VII Remake in the first place, it just being a straightforward retread of what came before. So yeah, I'm sure some people will dig it. I wanted more from it.
I'm conflicted, honestly, on to where I stand. I haven't played this, and I will eventually when it is way cheaper than £40. On the one hand, I would like to just experience it as it was, with refreshed graphics.
Yeah. Because,
sure, I never played Crisis Core. It's accessible to more people now. Probably works quite nicely on the Steam Deck. Feels like a good fit for me. But yeah, on the other hand, I would like a bit more context for that character, because it is a bombshell reveal at the end of Remake, and I didn't know who that was. I was like, oh yeah, who's that? It would be nice to kind of have that context running in, and almost for it to feed into it. It'd be nice if that was also slightly changed, the ending, so I could understand maybe what had changed, or what they were referencing this time around. So let's litigate sort of the three avenues people have to get into Final Fantasy VII at the moment, because there are three very different ways, and I think all of them have their own flaws, and it's starting to get a little bit messy. So in my mind, you've got three entry points. You have Remake, which is available on Steam, but it is incomplete. Part 2 set to launch next year. Question mark whether or not they'll hit that date because these games are incredibly lavish. And goodness knows when Part 3 will arrive. We're talking years down the line at this point.
Yep.
Then you have the original game, which did get a small glow up a few years ago. I forgot about that. They did remaster it slightly to make it more palatable. And you can pick that up for peanuts on Steam. I think it's £4 in sales a lot of the time. And that's the whole game. That's start to finish, you get that original game in a complete package. And then there's the Crisis Core remake, which is technically the start of the Final Fantasy VII story. However, I did learn this morning that technically it's the third entry in the timeline, just ahead of a bad battle royale and another mobile game that was never released outside of Japan, because Square Enix love to do that with their JRPG series. If someone came up to me and said, where should I start playing Final Fantasy VII, even though I've only played Remake, part of me, because I wish I'd done this, feels like I'd recommend the original game. But where do you stand with this?
I mean, it's a tricky one for sure. I think probably because the games reference each other so kind of, they overlap so much, I think probably the original game is the best place to start, because you need to have played the original game really to understand what Remake is doing differently and to understand the kind of the references that it's making and how it's changing things. You also kind of need to have played the original game to really understand what the heck Zack's deal is. Like, he does appear as a kind of, a mysterious presence in the latter stages of Final Fantasy VII in a kind of flashback scene to explain why Cloud is all Mako poisoned, and kind of at that point in the story, parts of Cloud's identity are revealed at that point, and Zack is quite tied closely to them. But I think while Crisis Core might chronologically be the best place to start, because it starts at the beginning and introduces all the stuff before Final Fantasy VII went down. But equally, I think, again, it plays on the knowledge that who Sephiroth is, like, the relevance of, like, oh, Cloud's here now, and it's like, what's his deal? And yeah, it still feels very referential to the main game. So even though, chronologically, the first one, I would still probably, as you say, recommend starting with the original game, because everything stems from there, really. And don't bother with Advent Children. You don't need to waste 2 hours of your time watching that film.
Not a big Advent Children head, Catherine?
It was fine. I was very excited when it came out. I quite liked the idea of a Final Fantasy CG film, because the previous Final Fantasy CG film, The Spirits Within, was absolutely garbage. But it also, in hindsight, is just not a very good film. Don't do it.
As someone who watches all of the Resident Evil CG films, it's pretty indefensible. I think you're totally right. Start with the original, maybe move on to Crisis Core after that, and then do Remake is going to be the best way of experiencing all these games, I think, because then you go into Remake with all of the knowledge of the original and probably have a deeper appreciation of what they have remade. Going back to like Walled Garden in stunning 4K is probably going to be more impactful if you've seen Walled Garden before.
When it was 3 polygons high.
Yeah, 3 beautiful polygons high. So final question then really is, how do you feel about the future of Final Fantasy VII, and are you excited for what comes next? Yeah,
I think so. Like I say, I've really dug what they did with Final Fantasy VII Remake. I think, like many people, went in expecting just a beat-for-beat remake of the original game. And when they started doing some weird stuff with it, oh boy, it's like, that's way more interesting to me than just, like, replaying the same old game over and over again. So I mean, the ending of 7 Remake was bonkers, I'm not going to lie. Much of it is still unexplained, or, it's kind of unclear how it's going to play out in Rebirth and whatever the heck they're going to call the third one, whenever that might arrive. But as I say, I'm really up for the direction that they're taking it in. I suspect it may well disappear up its own lore hole at some point, but like I'll take that when it arrives. At this time, I'm excited about the future of Final Fantasy VII.
I mean, Nomura is writing it, so I think it is going to disappear right up there, isn't it? But God love it. I'm excited to see what happens.
Yeah.
I just hope in the Rebirth we do not have to do any more pull-up mini-games, because I was listening to the soundtrack before we chatted, and the remix of the battle theme came on, and I feel like I get the sweats just thinking about having to do those pull-up mini-games. Good lord,
it was
that
definitely the
game.
best music for that minigame. Not gonna lie, excellent music.
Yeah. Oh, the soundtrack is so good. Like, I'm almost just excited for a new collection of tracks in the next remake as much as anything else.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, what a game. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and we will definitely have to get your Final Fantasy expertise back when 16 comes out, which I know we're both very excited for.
Oh yeah, very excited. Bring it on.
Thank you so much for watching. For all your PC gaming needs, make sure to check out rockpapershotgun.com, and it's goodbye from me, and goodbye from Catherine.
Goodbye.